All right, so I'm about to summarize the part of the apologetics course that covered Darwinian evolution and the problem of evil. So, starting in week 12, we introduced the topic of evolution, describing how it works and why one might believe it. The key point is that a change in genotype can ultimately cause a change in fitness, which is an organism's ability to reproduce. So if we look at the tree of life depicted here, we are able to progress down the branches due to three steps. Step one is genetic variation. Change the genotype to cause a change in fitness in some organisms. Step two is to naturally select those genetic variants that are more highly fit. Step three is, after the unfit individuals have been unable to pass on their genes, you have a slightly different population. The logic is to repeat these three steps over millions of years until you have a different species. So, how do you account for the forks in the tree of life? This is done by splitting the population and subjecting each subpopulation to the three steps mentioned. So, an example is Darwin's finches, in which the large-beaked finches survived in a time of drought because of their increased ability to eat certain seeds. Also, there were many subpopulations of finches, each of which adapted to their own environment. So that is how evolution worked. We then identified four assumptions that it makes. It assumes that a nearly infinite number of the following exists. Firstly, there is the naturally selective event. This event must be fine-tuned to select the genetic variant. For example, increasing the temperature of the climate won't select finches with bigger beaks, but a drought will. Secondly, you need a nearly infinite amount of time. Though technically finite, evolution requires vast amounts of time to function, which is a topic that is under debate. Thirdly, evolution needs a nearly infinite number of organisms because the vast majority of them fail to reproduce. This is more of an issue for larger organisms, where limited resources limit the amount of them that you can have. Fourthly, and this is the focus of the argument from irreducible complexity seen later in this course, evolution assumes that a nearly infinite number of intermediate states exists. It assumes that organisms are simple enough that they can change into a fundamentally different kind of organism in small steps. And as we will see, this assumption is the most faulty of them all. So in summary, evolution works in theory and has much surface level evidence, both of which fall apart upon further examination. In week 13 of this course, we addressed theistic evolution and the evidence used to support evolution. Theistic evolution is the idea that God used evolution as a tool in his hands to diversify life. This runs into problems, not the least of which is one of definition. Evolution, by definition, is a random process that cannot be guided. The moment God guides evolution, it is no longer evolution. The only way you can escape this is to say that God did not guide evolution in any way, which depicts him as the deistic kind of God, which is not the idea of God that many proponents of theistic evolution have in mind. Secondly, the timeline of evolution contradicts the Bible, particularly the Genesis account of creation, but also the way in which this Genesis account is referenced as a literal event in other books of the Bible. I also address the motives behind theistic evolution. Usually, it is done out of a desire to appease our present culture, to make Christianity more palatable in the eyes of the non-Christian. Proper biblical interpretation involves interpreting Scripture for what it says, not what we want it to say. And I believe the Bible has a lot to say about the fear of man. We then examined the biochemical evidence often given in support of Darwinian evolution, which included junk DNA, similarity in genotypes, and microevolution. Junk DNA is DNA that apparently has no purpose and was supposedly inherited from our ancestors. It turns out that junk DNA does have a purpose. It is not junk. It controls the timing, levels of expression, and length of expression of different genes, much like the italics in a set of play instructions would control the actions of an actor. Some would say that the similarity in genotypes between ape and man, for example, indicates that we have a common ancestor. Know that this can also indicate a common creator, but that idea is discarded, in part for philosophical reasons addressed in the Faith versus Science series. In any case, This level of similarity only accounts for the 2% of genes that actually encode for proteins and ignores what is thought to be junk. As we said earlier, the junk is not actually junk, so this poses a problem. When you include the quote unquote junk, the level of similarity drops to about 95 to 96%, referring to chimps and humans. Secondly, and more importantly, using the linear sequence of DNA as a metric to compare organisms is misleading because there is much more information that is encoded within an organism that is not revealed in the linear sequence of DNA. This includes the timing, length of expression, and a level of expression of certain genes in relation to one another. And this information is ignored because it yields more dissimilarity between species than Darwinian evolution would suggest. The fallacy was illustrated by looking at two books written by the same author in the same language and saying that because they have the same alphabet, or they use the same alphabet, that they must have the same meaning. Thirdly, microevolution was addressed. The logic is that if organisms can change in small increments over small amounts of time, as we see happening on a daily basis, then why can't they change in large increments over large amounts of time? Well, this is theoretically possible, but involves a large extrapolation, where we extrapolate the findings over a few thousand years of breeding over billions of years of supposed evolution. Extrapolations are not necessarily false, but they need to be shown that they are safe to make through the best current estimates, such as through breeding experiments that would show that the rate of evolution is indeed linear and does not run into outside variables that might slow the rate of change. But this has not been done, not even in theory. As it is, with respect to microevolution, macroevolution is an unjustified extrapolation. Secondly, there is no such thing as microevolution. The changes are actually quite large. In Darwin's day, it was easy to imagine one organism changing into the other because all they had was a surface level look and did not understand the underlying biochemistry. But a deeper look, as afforded by modern science, reveals that there is much underlying complexity that Darwin's theory did not account for. Much like popping the hood to a car reveals that the complexity of the engine extends far beyond its superficial appearance. So if we pop the hood on Darwin's finches, so to speak, it actually reveals a high degree of complexity that cannot have originated in small steps. So in summary, the biochemical evidence for evolution makes sense intuitively, but does not stand against scrutiny. Weeks 14 through 15 of this course introduced and defended the idea of irreducible complexity, which is an offensive argument against evolution by natural selection. A system that is irreducibly complex cannot have evolved in successive slight modifications because of its interdependent parts, much like you cannot form an engine in small steps. Note that Darwin said these small steps were absolutely necessary for his theory to function. So irreducible complexity defeats evolution by Darwin's own logic. So we compared the complexity within an engine to the complexity of three irreducibly complex systems, which included the systems required to change the beak size in Darwin's finches, the rhodopsin pathway pictured above, and the systems contained within the first cell. In reality, there are many more irreducibly complex systems than three, but I gave three because that was all that was needed to make my point. We then answered objections to irreducible complexity from both science and philosophy. Scientific objections included the rearrangement hypothesis and scaffolding, and an example of a philosophical objection is the apparent design from randomness theory, which states that organisms only have the appearance of being designed, but are not actually designed. We address these objections, yielding the summary statement that no natural explanation exists for how irreducibly complex systems originated. This yielded the necessary implication that irreducibly complex systems need a designer, which we called X. We don't know what X is with certainty, which is why we called it X, but we know that it must have at least 10 attributes to design irreducibly complex systems. We know that it must be undesigned, uncaused, have no beginning, be immaterial, supernatural, powerful, willful, alive, intelligent, personal, and arguably have a relational attitude of goodwill toward its creation. All these were necessary for X to be X, yielding the conclusion that beyond a reasonable doubt, X is God. So, the attributes of X as revealed through irreducibly complex systems are like God's fingerprint. They are unique to Him only, and therefore reveal the identity of X. We then answered 12 objections to intelligent design. Know that this is a triggering conclusion, so you will need to be ready to answer objections to it, especially in a scientific environment. These included 5 objections to the intelligent designer, such as saying that we are committing the God of the gaps fallacy, or that X is just a lot like God but not actually God, or that we are just making our conclusion because of religious bias, or that the imperfection in design disproves the existence of a designer, or that intelligent design is just creationism in disguise. We referred to the Faith versus Science series to answer objections against the miraculous nature of intelligent design. We answered 3 objections to the methodology of our argument, such as demanding that God has a designer, given his level of complexity. This is a classical example of the red herring fallacy. It is a complete distraction from the idea that a designer is needed, and in fact, if its own logic is followed, points towards the existence of an infinitely complex creator, just like religion says there is. We also address the idea that X might not behave according to our laws of logic, or that X is just a being that is like God but is not actually God. We also addressed 3 objections to the supernatural nature of God, including that supernatural beings cannot be scientifically tested, for any conclusion about them is scientific, it is therefore unscientific, or that via the Lemon test we cannot even offer evidence for our theory because of its supernatural conclusion. Or there is the idea that supernatural explanations impede the progress of science. We addressed each of these in turn, yielding the conclusion that intelligent design follows necessarily from irreducible complexity and has stood the test of criticism. In week 17, we identified other problems for evolution not mentioned previously. These include other irreducibly complex mechanisms, such as photosynthesis in plants, locomotion, the interplay between different bodily systems, and the processes of transcription and translation, which we described in even further detail. The number of irreducibly complex mechanisms is so numerous that it effectively dismantles macroevolution, for each one places a barrier in the tree of life that cannot be overcome by natural selection. Furthermore, the complexity of irreducibly complex systems makes it very difficult to fundamentally change the organisms that have them. So, irreducibly complex systems restrict evolution not only by evolution's inability to explain their origin, but also by its inability to explain how these systems continued to evolve once being formed. Therefore, the number of irreducibly complex systems and the complexity therein supports the biblical idea that we have not one, but many common ancestors. Irreducibly complex systems are not the only threat to macroevolution. We also talked about fine-tuned mechanisms, which are mechanisms that function so well that the organism not just survives, but thrives. An example is the ability of the human eye to detect the light of a single candle from over a mile away. To say that this was selected for, one must say that the lack of this ability would prevent those organisms from reproducing. But this is not realistic, as a person that can only see a candle from half a mile away isn't going to get weeded out. So, the selective advantage must be enough that without it, you cannot pass on your genes, something that does not account for fine-tuned mechanisms. Lastly, and most importantly, we live in a way that suggests we did not evolve. I chose to include this because it is powerful logically, but also shows that we do not need a degree in biochemistry to understand that we did not evolve. And since actions speak louder than words, it also shows that the evolutionist agrees with you, despite claiming that they believe in evolution. For example, we live as if we had an objective sense of purpose, which is not something that evolution can explain. Evolution posits that we evolved from chemicals and When we die, that's it. Fundamentally, the human is no different from the amoebic slime. So you can make something up like going and saving the spotted owls, but in the end, we have no more purpose than this asteroid floating through empty space with no reference point. Obviously, we live in a way that contradicts this. The same is true of morality. Let's pretend that evolution can explain what our purpose is, and then that purpose is to propagate one's own genes. I say this because those who say our morality evolved give that for an ultimate purpose, the foundation of our morality. This foundation, as discussed in Part 6 of the Evolution series, is unstable and cannot explain why we act as if some things are always right or always wrong. Such morality is subject to one's own desires. Because of this, evolution justifies any kind of selfish behavior so long as one can get away with it. Obviously, most of us live in a way that contradicts this. So when we look at the world around us and see the mass shootings, the psychiatric disorders, the wars and conflicts that seem to be increasing over the past 150 years, we shouldn't be surprised, for man is simply acting like the brute that evolution told him he was. So evolution cannot explain where we get morality from. The same is true of intelligence, conservation, and emotions, although I lack the time here to defend them. And lastly, it cannot justify avoiding racism and sexism. In fact, it encourages it. If the ultimate good is to pass on one's genes, then our worth is defined genetically. This means that there is a superior race and an inferior race, and a superior sex and an inferior sex. Instead of avoiding racism and sexism, as many evolutionists would try to do, their theory actually justifies it. And it goes a step further. If these people are indeed inferior, then their very existence is a threat to the gene pool. Hitler and Stalin were right to interpret evolution in this way. Genetic purgings are evolution's natural consequence. As it is, we live like racism and sexism are wrong, meaning we don't live like evolved beings. So we see that the objector, despite claiming to believe in evolution, does not actually believe it. They already agree with you, and this is seen by their actions. Now, it is possible that evolution does explain the belief in these things. For example, having a sense of purpose increases one's fitness by increasing their motivation to live, even if that belief is not grounded in fact. And this is possible, but it does not explain why we would lose that selective advantage now, at a time when, arguably, we need these things more than ever. That is, if having a sense of purpose was merely an adaptation to help us survive, then why are we now ridding ourselves of it when we still need it to survive? And, in any case, for the modern evolutionist who is aware of nature's deception, they are morally obligated to make their beliefs match each other. To continue to suppress the truth about morality or emotions would be dishonest for them. So, we do not act like evolved beings in our physiology or in our beliefs. Therefore, evolution is a vastly incomplete theory, made in a time before modern biochemical advances, a time when life was thought to be simple. So that wraps up evolution. To its credit, it is a theory that makes sense on the surface. Unfortunately, it does not hold up to scrutiny. This is why it is largely accepted by the general population, but many secular people and even educational institutions are becoming increasingly skeptical of it, even resorting to crazier theories to replace it in order to maintain their presuppositions. Know that evolution is oftentimes treated like a religion. It therefore can play the role of a philosophical barrier to hearing the gospel, much like relativism or naturalism. Although it is technically an evidential objection and was dealt with as such, it is often treated as far more than that, and was therefore included in the same course that addressed philosophical barriers like relativism and naturalism. So if you are sharing the gospel with an ardent evolutionist, know that evolution, for them, can function as a philosophical barrier, despite being a scientific hypothesis. That wraps up evolution. Next on the list, we had the problem of evil, described by some as the atheist stronghold, the irrefutable argument against theism. The problem of evil states, how can a loving God allow so much evil? It takes the form of the following argument, which states that if God were loving, he would not allow evil to exist. God does allow evil to exist, yielding the conclusion that God is not loving. Note that the problem of evil is seen as an atheistic argument. Theoretically, it would allow for an evil God to exist, but since the only type of God to be proposed is good, this is effectively an atheistic argument. After introducing the objection, I gave 4 reasons for why Christians do not have to directly answer the question. The objection distracts us from 2 important topics. One is the underlying motives behind the objection, which often sets man's intellect and reasoning up as the ultimate source of truth. We see this if we look at history. The problem of evil did not become a popular objection until the Enlightenment era, a time in which religious views were thought to be replaced with reason. It also distracts us from the basics of salvation. No amount of ulterior motives on the part of God makes our salvation through Christ any less necessary. To date, Christianity is the only religion to offer a Savior, a solution for our sin, and for unbelievers to remain in unbelief because of philosophical objections can prove to be a distraction. Also, there are 2 attributes of God that should make us reluctant to accuse him. One is his omniscience. Imagine attempting to prosecute a defendant that is infinitely intelligent, infinitely wise, and made you from dust. This attribute should discourage any moral accusation of such a being. The second attribute is his immutability, or his inability to change. This means that God must be entirely good or entirely evil. There is no in between. So, the atheist must explain away all of God's good actions as somehow belonging to an all-evil God. But it is far easier for me as a Christian to explain how a good God can allow evil than it is for an atheist to explain how an evil God could die on the cross for his enemies. So, given God's immutability, we can answer God's supposedly evil actions, like allowing evil to exist, with the far greater number of his good actions, simply giving God the benefit of the doubt, if indeed there is doubt. After introducing the objection, we then gave a philosophical answer to the problem of evil. We employed a modified version of the moral argument to say that the God being accused by the objector is the same God that is the source of the moral values used to accuse him. The moral of the story was, don't question your standard. Doing so would be like measuring a 2x4 with a tape measure, and then using the measurements on the 2x4 to question the tape measure. Or it would be like sawing off the tree branch you are sitting on. Any moral objection to God undermines itself. How did we show this? I pointed out that the accusation is really against any being that has the ultimate power to end evil, which we called Y. We then stated, through 3 steps, that the accusation of Y uses absolute moral values which need a source X. We then showed that Y equals X through several arguments. So, the being that the objector accuses, Y, is the same being that is the source of their absolute moral values, X. Thus, the objection defeats itself. This argument is stronger than it appears because it does not require its debater to make many outside truth claims that could potentially be contested. Its focus is entirely on the self-defeating nature of the objection. So the debater does not need to say the following: God exists. In the argument, God only has to exist in the objector's mind, not in actuality. One does not have to say which God is X or Y. For the objector, the being they accuse is automatically Y, which is necessarily the source of the moral values X. We do not have to say what is morally right or wrong. The only thing that matters is that the objector thinks there are some things that are right or wrong, such as their belief that to see evil, have the ability to end it, and choose not to is morally wrong. To illustrate this, we gave an example of a cannibal who is angry at God for allowing, in his mind, the existence of savage nations like the United States where cannibalism is not practiced. Even for him, the objection defeats itself. For why, what is being accused, is necessarily the source of the moral values used to accuse it, X. On the same note, we do not need to defend God's character. The objector already assumes that his character is perfect, or they would not be using it as a moral standard. So, the problem of evil objection necessarily defeats itself. In week 21 of the course, we introduced the biblical answer to the problem of evil. We started by answering a question: why use the Bible if the objector probably doesn't even believe it? Well, we don't need the Bible to be true. We only need it to be a source of plausible arguments to defend God's character. Secondly, the Bible happens to be the main witness in defense of the Christian faith. To throw it out would be like killing the witnesses in a trial. Thirdly, and most importantly, the objector assumes for argument's sake that certain parts of the Bible are true in order to fuel their objection, such as God existing and him having sovereignty over evil. They then discredit the Bible any time a reasonable answer to their objection is given. But if the Bible is not credible, then we cannot trust what it has to say about God's existence and sovereignty over evil. Thus, the objector undermines their own argument by attempting to throw out biblical answers. If we are going to make an objection based on biblical concepts, then we must hear what it has to say in response, lest we be using a double standard. Secondly, we explained how the fact that all evil comes from sin is a necessary ingredient to future arguments and in adopting a more humble attitude in addressing this objection. Because all evil comes from sin, there is no differentiation between the problem of evil and the problem of suffering, for the latter results from the former. Therefore, the Bible's answers to the problem of evil also address the problem of suffering. This greatly simplifies the approach as well as helps us to adopt a more humble attitude in addressing it, knowing that we are the source of our problems. We then established God's relation to evil. Firstly, God claims to be X from week 20. He says things like, "Be holy, for I am holy," and he claims that it is his holy, righteous character that forms the basis for our moral values. Therefore, the Bible is in agreement that any moral accusation of God defeats itself. The Bible also says that God is completely sovereign over evil, meaning that he can end it when he wants. Therefore, the fact that he has not ended it means that he wants it to exist. He does not want evil, but he most certainly wants it to exist, or he would not have let it exist. This key distinction is something the objector often fails to see, leading them to make certain category errors. Many of these errors were addressed, but one of them is the idea that God can somehow create evil, that by allowing it, he is somehow directly responsible for it. But remember, if God's character is the standard for righteousness, then he cannot create evil, for evil is merely the absence of himself. Light cannot create darkness, for darkness is the absence of light, and heat cannot create cold, for cold is the absence of heat. And God cannot create evil, for evil is merely the absence of God. God cannot be what he is, by definition, not. Saying that God creates evil was one of many category errors we addressed. So, in summary, the Bible, the valid source for this matter, shifts the focus away from our merit and onto God's sovereignty, a sovereignty that does not contradict his other attributes, like his love, that laid the foundation for the rest of our answers to the problem of evil. In week 22, we internally critiqued the problem of evil objection in two ways. The first way drew from the concept from week 1 that no neutral ground exists, and the objector is in fact making truth claims that need to be defended just as much as the truth claims of the Christian. These take the form of 5 presuppositions. In offering the problem of evil objection, man is allowed to usurp God in his governance or ability to rule, his attributes that enable him to rule, his centrality as the central good of the universe, his role as truth source, and his role as the ultimate source of spiritual satisfaction. We defended each of these in turn, but the conclusion was that neutral ground does not exist, especially in the throne room of our heart. In our heart, just as the Bible says, there is only room for one king, and our options are Christ or self. In the problem of evil objection, when Christ is thrown out, self inevitably rises to take his place. and self's right to rule is something that most certainly needs to be defended, and yet rarely is. Our second approach involved questioning what the objector would do if they were God. They are effectively saying that they can do a better job with dealing with evil than God does, so what exactly do they have in mind? If the objector has thought about this at all, their plan usually involves eliminating our ability to sin, or free will, the consequences of sin, or the person who sins, the sinner, all things that God chose to allow. Sure, God could have made a world without free beings, but blaming him for not doing so is a blame shift. We are at fault. It is not, as the objector would say, like giving a baby a knife. The very definition of free will implies that we have a choice in the matter and are therefore morally accountable for our sin. This is therefore not something that can be blamed on God. Some would say eliminate the consequences of sin, but they do not realize that the Bible defines sin as something that lies beneath the surface. Sin is the heart condition that energizes our outward actions, including our deeds, words, and even our thoughts and motivations. Therefore, for God to eliminate the consequences of sin without eliminating the underlying sin would be like cutting a weed off at ground level, but leaving the root, the most deadly part, intact. So the objector might say, okay, well then God should eliminate the root as well. Eliminate the sinner, the psychopaths, mass murderers, rapists, dictators, and sex traffickers, the scumbags who are the source of all our problems. But this neglects what Romans 3:23 says about the root of sin lying in each of us. So the objector, in asking God to remove the sinner, is begging for their own destruction. They should be thankful that God has allowed their own problem of evil to exist. There is a self-righteous aspect to this proposal. Which sinner gets to decide which sinners to eliminate? And when two sinners come to opposing conclusions about which sinners to eliminate, who decides between them? I say this because do you think that either of these sinners will choose to eliminate sins like their own? Of course not, for the objector has a self-righteous conflict of interest. As it is, the objector should be thankful that God, in his mercy, has allowed their own problem of evil to persist, and maybe they should consider the idea that God has provided a way for their sin to be punished without punishing them, namely a substitute. So in summary of week 22, the objector cannot offer a viable alternative plan for dealing with evil, perhaps because they have multiple conflicts of interest. And if appropriate, we should strongly question the motives behind the problem of evil objection. In weeks 23 through 24 of the course, we examined 4 biblical trends that indirectly answer the problem of evil. In other words, they answer the question without answering the question. Trend number 1 is that God is not indifferent to evil. He hates evil and therefore promises to destroy it. He also restrains it in many ways. And lastly, he experienced evil in its worst form on the cross. So we don't know what the answer is yet, but we know that it cannot be that God does not care. He cares about it more than us because he is morally perfect and we are not. The second trend is that God has plans that we know nothing about. If we look at biblical examples like the enslavement of Joseph, the rebellion of Israel, the crucifixion of Christ, and the oppression of Job, we see that God had a purpose for allowing evil unbeknownst to the sufferers. So, it is only logical to assume that God has a plan for our present suffering that we might not know about. Thirdly, God reconciles the inconceivable. Through the singular act of Christ's work on the cross, God's justice was reconciled with his mercy. Sinners were reconciled with a holy God, and Jew was reconciled with Gentile. If God can bridge 3 gaps that were thought to be unbridgeable through one act, then is it possible for him to bridge the apparent gap between his love and his allowance of evil? I think it would be logical, and I emphasize the word logical, to assume so. Fourthly, God has a history of being falsely accused. We see this through Eve in Genesis, the nation of Israel in Numbers, Israel's elders in 1 Samuel, Job in Job chapter 9, Peter in Matthew 16, and the Pharisees in Matthew 12. In each of these situations, sin distorted the viewer's judgment so they thought they were right and God was wrong. Particularly, it was their desire for power and control that led them to usurp God's role in their life, and accusing God was a great way to justify that. This trend alone, as well as the nature of who is being accused, should lead the objector to approach the subject with an attitude of humility. This is rarely done. So, in summary, once we take our own motives into account, can we trust a God who is compassionate, infinite, and bridge building to have good reasons for allowing evil? It would be logical to do so. So, we don't need to have an answer for there to be one. In week 25, we directly answered the question, why does God allow evil? By giving 5 biblical reasons. Firstly, God allows evil to glorify himself, much like the sun's rays in the forest could not be seen apart from the presence of dust in the air. God's love and mercy would not be seen if evil were not a possibility. Without evil, there would be no sin, which means the cross would not be necessary, in which case we would not know the full extent of God's love. And when we embrace his love for us, that brings him glory, something the Bible is clear about. And there are numerous objections to this, which we answered. So God allows evil firstly for his glory. Secondly, he allows it to make a willing relationship with him possible. A forced relationship is no relationship at all. Thirdly, God allows evil to save evildoers. He waits with patience as the evildoer commits their acts for them to turn to him in repentance. Therefore, the objector should be thankful that God, in his patience, has not chosen to destroy them, but has so far tolerated their own acts of evil. Fourthly, God allows evil to drive people to repentance. Much like the person with congenital analgesia, which is the genetic inability to sense pain, would place themselves in great danger, the person who cannot feel spiritual pain would not be driven to its ultimate solution, God. God, who takes into account both spirit and body, takes a more holistic approach in helping mankind. Unlike us, he is not willing to sacrifice our eternal well-being on the altar of our temporary comfort. Fifthly, God allows evil to strengthen believers. Much like the dross in gold is removed only by fire, a believer's impurity is removed only by trials. And God does this in multiple ways, but the end result is that the hidden value of the gold is brought forth. And in the Christian's case, the value is not their own merit, but rather something of God's production, called the new creation in Corinthians. And when God does this, the world benefits through it, for the church is Christ's hands and feet on earth. So, in summary, even though we don't need to know why God allows evil, as demonstrated on the previous slide, God has nevertheless given us some of his reasons. So that wraps up the problem of evil objection. I included it because it is a very popular objection. Even some Christians struggle with it. It, like a philosophical worldview, like relativism or naturalism, can also be an obstacle to hearing the gospel, especially if the objector has endured the problem of evil personally. So I addressed 2 philosophical barriers, relativism and naturalism, and 2 pseudo-philosophical barriers, evolution and the problem of evil. But in summary, opposing arguments were destroyed, and in the process, a fair amount of evidence supporting the existence of a theistic God was offered. However, the apologetic is not yet complete, as the Christian God remains undifferentiated from other theistic gods. There is more to come on this later. So hopefully, by learning to address the underlying motivations, the driving force behind many modern objections to the Bible, we will cultivate an audience that is more receptive to hearing the evidence that is specific to Christianity. Thank you for watching.